All right, all right. 1 2 1 2. Hey, I'm Johnny, and I'm here with Dr. Meryl Nass. She is an expert in internal medicine and also an expert on biological warfare and vaccine safety. With over 4 decades of medical experience, Dr. Nass has been at the forefront of investigating anthrax, chronic multi-symptom illnesses, and questioning public health policies. We'll dive into her journey, her research, and why she believes open debate in medicine matters more than ever. Welcome, doctor. How are you doing today?
Hey, thank you. I'm doing great. Glad to be here, Johnny.
It's great to have you. Yeah, I am honored. We've got these liability shields going on, and we see how this is just kind of taken away our agency when it comes to vaccines. And now they're pushing for this with big ag chemicals. How did we get here?
Well, that's a good question. How did we get here? In 1986, the pharmaceutical manufacturers went to President Reagan and said, look, we're getting sued for injuries due to vaccines. There have been some TV shows showing that babies got injured from vaccines. We're getting sued. We can't make any money. And we think we're just going to stop making them unless you give us a liability shield. Now, that was based on what happened in 1976, 10 years earlier, when um, a fake terror campaign about swine flu was spread throughout the United States. So one person died at Fort Dix, New Jersey in 1976 after a forced march. They found a swine flu influenza virus in him and claimed that this could be another 1918 flu in which supposedly 50 million people died around the world. And therefore, we had to do something, and we needed the pharmaceutical companies to make vaccines for it. Now, after the one guy died, nobody else died. The virus, if it even was there, died out, but a process had gotten going where the American people had been told there was this dangerous thing, but the government was going to save them. And pharmaceutical companies started researching the vaccine, and then they went to the government and said, look, our insurance companies won't insure us. You want this in a hurry. We don't know if we can make it safe enough. We're not going to make it unless you give us a liability shield. And the government did that in 76. And a quarter of the American population got a vaccine. It turned out to cause Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a paralytic disorder that is usually not permanent but can be permanent. And it was hidden from the public that, in fact, there was no virus. There was no need for this vaccine. And it was just basically bureaucrats gone wild. Then in 86, the manufacturers came back to the government and said, look, we're not going to make the childhood vaccines. And there were only very few at that time, unless you immunize us from claims. And so the government said, okay. And they created the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program with special masters. So you could no longer sue in federal court. You could at that point sue a company that made vaccines in state court if you felt they had caused a severe injury. But in 2011, there was a Supreme Court decision that closed that door. So you could no longer sue in state courts either. Your only option was to use the vaccine injury program of the government. And many people applied, and in different years, some years only a few were compensated, and some years most were compensated. It was very variable. It seemed to be a political process. But you couldn't go to court. You could bring a lawyer. Then in 2005, having been so successful with these programs, the industry and the Department of Defense pushed something called the PrEP Act, which would give which would allow even an unlicensed product to be pushed out, a drug or a vaccine, to the American people without any liability. And Congress passed a law, passed the PrEP Act to enable this to happen. And they were told at the time that this was just about protecting our soldiers. So if the soldiers were in some area where anthrax or Ebola was happening and there was no licensed vaccine, but we had one that we thought would work anyway, we wanted to be able to give it to them. So therefore we needed the PrEP Act. Okay, so it was all good. What that was really about was the fact that a group I worked with had brought a lawsuit against the government for its licensed anthrax vaccine, for which there was no evidence it worked, and it did cause a lot of harm to soldiers. And so the license had been removed by Judge Emmett Sullivan. So they had this unlicensed anthrax vaccine. They wanted to use it on soldiers, and so they got the PrEP Act, which enabled them to continue doing that even without a license. Okay, so PrEP Act really didn't do much between 2005 and 2020, but all of a sudden, COVID comes along, and now the PrEP Act is being used to usher in unlicensed vaccines and drugs with only the merest hint that they might work. And it wasn't just to the military, but to the entire US population. And I don't think Congress had any idea what they had wrought when they passed this bill in 2005. So they had created the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, but so far, less than 2% of people who have made claims that have been adjudicated have been compensated. Very hard to get any money, very hard to prove an injury. And this is, without this PrEP Act, you see, Pfizer, Moderna, Novavax would not have been willing to roll out any vaccines to the public because they would have been liable for injuries, because the 1986 Act was for childhood vaccines only. So if your vaccine had not been recommended by the CDC to be put on the childhood schedule, if it was on the childhood schedule, you were immune from prosecution. But if it wasn't on the childhood schedule, you could still be sued. So companies would have been subject to liability at the beginning of the COVID experience without the PrEP Act. And so that's what happened. They've rolled out their vaccines. They haven't had to pay a dime in compensation. And they knew at some point, as did the government, and now all of us know as well, that the vaccines really basically didn't work and were very unsafe.
Right. And if it wasn't for that liability shield they have, these shots would have been pulled long ago. They would have pulled them
Exactly.
off the market themselves because they would be losing billions, wouldn't they?
Exactly. So
So,
that's the story of liability shields. They enable things to happen that you don't want to happen.
to me, this is a suspension of rule of law where it matters most, and this is also, gets in the way of a free market, right? We like the idea that things take care of themselves with people trying to help each other out and maximize profits. But when we have no rule of law for the biggest profiteers, and these are international conglomerates, by the way, they have no loyalty to us nationally or to us as citizens. This is just wild, and we can't let this continue to keep happening. So, Thomas Massie has introduced a bill to repeal the PrEP Act. Is that right?
Yes, he has. That bill I haven't read. Sorry, I was thinking about his new version of the Prime Act. But yes, there are a couple of bills that repeal part of the PrEP Act. I think Massey's repeals part of it, but not the complete act. And unfortunately, Massey, because he is so honest and so determined, he has fallen on the wrong side of President Trump and Speaker of the House Mike Johnson several times. And so he will get no support from either of them on any bills he puts forward. And that's a big problem. Basically, he has the conservative wing of the Republican Party has mostly gone along with him, but he has not gotten the mainstream Republicans, and certainly has only gotten a very, very few Democrats.
It's a shame how politics can bear itself out these kind of petty disputes, and yeah, we it's just so clear. Yeah, we need our constitutional rights, due process. We need to hold these bad guys accountable. So now we have big ag lobbying for a pesticide liability shield. They've been doing this since last year, trying to put it in the farm bill, going state by state, and now they've got it in the House Appropriations Bill, Section 453. Is that right?
That's correct. Okay, so having seen how successful the vaccine liability shield was for the pharmaceutical companies, and then being faced with lots of lawsuits over primarily non-Hodgkin's lymphoma attributed to glyphosate, Bayer began a very aggressive campaign to turn its liability around, as you said. So let me go back. Pesticides are the most toxic consumer product we have. They are designed to kill things, whether it's bacteria, rodents, viruses, fungus, or weeds. They're designed to kill, and so the more you use, the more toxicity you're exposed to. We don't really know much about what happens when you're exposed to combinations of these things, and it's difficult to prove that when you used a pesticide correctly that it caused harm. But Bayer decided to buy Monsanto in 2016, and the sale was completed in 2018. Now, and Monsanto made glyphosate, Roundup, or glyphosate is the main ingredient in Roundup, and it is the most widely used herbicide and probably pesticide in the entire world. And they sell billions of dollars worth of it every year. And most farmers use it, and it's used both to cause crops to be harvestable at the same time. So if you spray it on right at the end of the season, all the crops will die, be desiccated, and they can be harvested at once rather than picking, a plant here and a plant there and having to go back several times.
Right, and this is something that we only do in the States, or if other countries do it, it's nothing compared to how we are. Is that right?
I don't know whether that's true. I think, there are 85 pesticides that are allowed in the United States that are banned in Europe or Japan or China even. China bans pesticides that are used here. And so clearly our EPA is laissez-faire about what they allow. There's a pesticide, dicamba, that's twice been pulled off the market by courts. And EPA is in the process of trying to issue it another permit again right now. So EPA is not our friend. It does not protect us. Well, what happened in 2018, just 2 months after Bayer bought Monsanto, is that a fellow with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and many skin lesions, a very sick man, Dwayne Johnson, a groundskeeper at a school who was using a lot of glyphosate for a number of years, won a lawsuit in California, and Bobby Kennedy, Michael Baum, and Brett Wisner were the lawyers on the case. So he won. He got a $200-something million settlement from the jury, which was later reduced to appeals to $21 million. And that began a flood of new cases, people who had been using glyphosate and had developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma decided to sue. And so the trial lawyers were all over this, and they collected 110,000 people who were wanting to sue Bayer Monsanto for their injuries from glyphosate. And 67,000, actually 177,000 cases, 67,000 have settled in the 7 years since then. And it has cost Bayer $11 billion to settle those cases and pay the legal fees. And so they decided enough is enough. They can't afford this anymore. And they started a very extensive plan to get rid of liability one way or the other. One of those plans was to go state by state and get the legislatures of states to vote to make it impossible to sue in state courts for injuries. They went to the Supreme Court. They took one of these cases that they had lost, and they said, look, we've lost cases in some jurisdictions, we've won cases in other jurisdictions, so now we need the Supreme Court to give us a final ruling. So that's pending now. 2 states, Georgia and North Dakota, have passed legislation preventing their own citizens from suing Bayer for injuries. Other states are dealing with it, and several states have voted it down. They've also threatened that they will just stop producing glyphosate and the farmers will be out of luck. They won't have their favorite herbicide. And they've tried to scare farmers and scare members of Congress, saying farmers really need this product and we're just going to stop making it because we can't make any money. Another method they've suggested is they could spin off part of Bayer, the Monsanto part, perhaps. They'll give it a certain amount of money, they'll let it pay off a few claims, and it will go bankrupt. And then there will be no more money to pay any claims. So that's what they're doing. But their biggest play is to get Congress, our entire Congress, to pass a law just like the 1986 Act for childhood vaccines that says nobody's allowed to sue pesticide manufacturers anymore in federal court, and the federal law will have application to the state. So it will supersede any state laws, so you won't be able to sue in state courts either. And the way they're doing that is an attempt to freeze a 1993 decision by the EPA that glyphosate is harmless. So what happened is EPA is supposed to every 15 years review again all its pesticides and see what new information has come up and whether it needs to change the label and the warnings. Well, EPA doesn't do this correctly, and so it has not actually finalized a new rule, a new label on glyphosate since 1993. However, a week before Biden left office, it rolled out a draft report that said glyphosate was a probable carcinogen and did acknowledge the other health issues for the first time. And this is a poison pill for Bayer. They can't allow this draft report to actually have any effect because it means they're going to lose a lot of lawsuits. So what they did is said in a rider that was added to the House Appropriations Bill for Interior and Environment and was passed last week by that committee, they said basically no money can, because it's an appropriation bill, no federal money can be spent to deal with this draft EPA report. Basically, it can't be reviewed, it can't be finalized, it can't be anything. And no other agencies can use it to make any determinations, which would freeze the 1993 guidance in place for a number of years and basically de facto stop lawsuits. So you could still bring a lawsuit against Bayer, but you're going to have a very hard time finding a lawyer who will take it on contingency, because now the way they were winning these cases was that Bayer knew what the injuries were and failed to warn. But if this bill is passed by the full House and Senate, now it's only been passed by a committee, you won't be able to sue using that argument. The cause of action, failure to warn, will disappear because EPA won't be allowed to warn at all, and Bayer would not be allowed. Bayer would not be permitted to issue any warnings that are different than the 1993 rule. So that's how it works.
It's so crazy. So they're taking away our right to stand up for ourselves, our right to accountability by taking away our informed consent. I've seen a lot of documentaries on this. Farmers are complaining, if the bottle would have said it caused cancer, I wouldn't have used it in flip-flops and in shorts, which is a way that they actually illustrate people using it in some of their advertising. So yeah, this is just as safe as salt, as safe as you can. So
water.
safe you
They
can get.
claim
Yeah.
safe as water.
So crazy. So and to your point, this kills things, right? So glyphosate specifically, it kills just about everything green, kills the microbes in the soil, kills the fungus. There's an EPA report, which I agree is thoroughly captured. 93% of endangered species are harmed by it. So it kills all the living, but it's safe for our kids to eat, safe to be sprayed on our crops at harvest. It's just the height of gaslighting, and the idea that they could have to settle or have to pay $11 billion in damages for families with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma for cancer, and then that they're still standing here trying to say, oh no, it doesn't cause cancer. It's just I don't know how they can get away with it. I don't know how anybody can stand with them. I'm a conservative. We've got a lot of conservative representatives, siding with them on this issue. This is a national security threat, right? This is being lobbied for by ChemChina, which is effectively state owned. It is China. China's lobbying for this to take away our rights for our kids to stand up for ourselves. Is that right? Do I understand that part correctly?
Yeah. So yeah, so another thing that Bayer did was they didn't go alone on this. Even though they put a $16 billion war chest aside to fight this, as well as to pay claims, they also organized about 400 other pesticide companies. There's something like 60,000 different pesticides on the market in the United States. The term pesticide includes herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, rodenticides, etc. And so they got hundreds of other companies to join in. And so all of their pesticides will also be shielded from liability because all the labels on those pesticides will be frozen also. And at least this is what we believe to be the case. So it starts out with just this little rider that says that that the labels will be frozen for glyphosate, but it extends to all labels for all pesticides. And so, who are the big pesticide manufacturers? Syngenta was bought by China, ChemChina. ChemChina is producing pesticides in China that are not allowed to be used in China and shipping them over here for us to use and to harm ourselves with. And there are other pesticide companies that are owned, and Bayer itself is a German company. It only entered the New York Stock Exchange in 2002. So it wasn't owned by Americans really at all before that. So we're dealing with foreign companies that are happy to offload their toxic products onto us and then demand liability protection. And of course, liability protection is a disaster because what happened with the COVID vaccines? Because they had the liability protections, they were able to make much more dangerous vaccines than if they didn't have it, because then they would have been responsible, for showing up in court when someone said they were injured and proving that their product was safe. These pesticide manufacturers know they're not going to succeed in courts generally. And so they're desperate for a liability shield, and with billions of dollars to spend on lobbying and whatever that means, they probably are able to control the EPA. They're able to control members of Congress and whoever else is necessary to be controlled in order to push this through. So the Constitution says we have a right to go to court if we feel we've been injured. In fact, it says in the Constitution, if there's more than $20 at stake, of course, this is $20 in 1986, $1786, we have a right to a trial by jury. What this does is, as I said before, it doesn't take away your right for a trial, but it takes away your ability to win in a trial, because they're sucking away the evidence that you need to win. And so, although it's not strictly unconstitutional, it's somewhat unconstitutional.
Well, so their argument in court is that we have to follow the warning label that EPA gives us.
Yes.
And so when the EPA gives a warning label that says it doesn't cause cancer, then they can go in the courtroom and say, listen, whether it caused cancer or not, the warning label says it can't cause cancer, and we have no control over that. So you can't hold us.
Right. And in fact,
right?
Even if we wanted to change it, EPA wouldn't let us, because the law says we have to stick with the label that EPA approved through a very complex multi-year process that is specified in a law called FIFRA, which is the Pesticide Labeling and Act that EPA goes by. So Bayer can say, look, we wanted to warn people, but FIFRA does not allow it.
It seems like a reach maybe for in a courtroom, but it seems logical that the attorney should be able to argue, hey, look, you froze the warning label by your lobbying of our legislature. You did this. You took away informed consent. We've got a mountain of science that shows these harms. You've had to pay a mountain of money for these harms already. This is clearly their MO. What they're doing is just trying to shield themselves from liability, and unreal they can get away with this.
Yeah. Well, it's up to us. I mean, if we are going to allow a whole class of toxic products to be shielded from liability, what comes next? The Pinto can bring back the gas tank in the back of the car, and you get exploding Pintos that the company knew about, but there's no liability for cars anymore, so they don't need to make cars safe. I mean, what is next? Drugs can be deadly, but there's no liability for drugs anymore. I mean, to start out giving a liability shield to the most dangerous products we use just doesn't make any sense. Where is it going to end up? And it's really, basically industry and the government teaming up against the public. And are we going to allow this, particularly when we're supposed to be in a MAHA time, make America healthy again and get rid of toxins, not encourage their use, and harm people by failing to improve the labels. So it's a very interesting political moment, and I'm sure a lot is going on behind the scenes. The House of Representatives is on recess until September 2nd, and when they come back, they will be voting on this. They will also have the Farm Bill to deal with, which may have also a rider about pesticides added to it. Glenn Thompson, who is the chairman of that committee, said he was going to put such a rider in. It was defeated previously. And, we'll have to see what deals have been made during the month of August and what Congress is going to do and what the White House, the MAHA White House is going to do. It's very scary.
To me, this should really resonate with conservative voters and representatives because this is affecting our kids. The endocrine disruptors, these are hormone disruptors. So many of our representatives have stood against the so-called gender-affirming care for minors. And I believe that whole agenda is perhaps a cover for what these chemicals are doing to us. And my fear is that God forbid this gets pushed through. I could see the conservatives losing the House, losing the Senate come midterms, and now you've got the other side who is explicitly for this crazy transgender agenda. We get the worst of both worlds this way. So yeah, it's just we've got to stand up. We've got to make these calls while we're at it. Hey, repeal the PrEP Act, and GOSAR put some good legislation forward to get some liability back for the immunization schedule for the kids as well. So
yes, absolutely. I think we have to. Liability shields only harm the public. There's no purpose for them. They're a gift to the industry. When the PrEP Act was put in place, the Congress was told it was going to save us money. We wouldn't have to, the government wouldn't have to pay for the insurance for the anthrax vaccine, for example, because so it was gonna help the government. That's why they passed it, and we see where we've ended up. And if there is another pandemic, the PrEP Act allows the government to roll out yet more experimental drugs and vaccines with no liability to the public. And certainly during the Biden administration, they were talking about developing vaccines in 100 days, where you can't possibly test them for safety when they're invented and manufactured and rolled out in 100 days. You have no idea what they're going to do to people. You can't test for safety in animals because animals don't respond the way humans do to drugs and vaccines. So anyway, the plan at the level of the WHO, the G7, the G20, the EU, the World Bank, and the Biden administration was 100-day vaccines for the next pandemic. And the only way they can do that is if they have a PrEP Act to protect the government, policymakers, and the manufacturers. So we really do need to get rid of this and not go along with these plans to turn the whole country into guinea pigs again.
This is an existential issue for us as a people. Our fertility rates are cratering. We're seeing so many miscarriages, associated with the COVID vaccines. We're seeing so much, a glyphosate is very harmful. It gets into the testes, affecting sperm counts. We're losing 1% fertility per year. Is what it amounts to. And yeah, so this is existential. Our lives, our liberties are all on the line right now. And yeah, it's a good time for us all to stand up about it.
So the question, what to do? Call your members of Congress. The Senate has to pass it, and the House. So call them both. The House is at recess. They're back in your neighborhood. Ask for an appointment and tell them you won't stand for this. This is really an abomination. It's government and industry in cahoots because of lobbying against the people. And we need their job is to protect us, not to harm us. So I have information on my Substack, merylnass.substack.com. The International Medical Alliance, IMA, has information. Stand for Health Freedom, Children's Health Defense. We all have information on this bill rider. And I'll give it to you, Johnny, so you can put it up on your website, and it'll give you the talking points when you call your Congress members.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And well, thank you so much for all the advocacy you're doing on this. I know you're also doing a lot for the farmers. There is an attack on our food supply. What can you tell us about that?
Sure, thanks. So yes, my organization, Door to Freedom, is rolling out a campaign to educate the public about the extraordinary attack on farmers and on our food that has been going on for years, and has caused 160,000 farmers to go out of business in a 5-year period. So USDA measures the number of farms. These are USDA numbers. 8% of farms went out of business between 2017 and 2022. And the reason for that is very complicated. They're being attacked a number of ways. There's too much regulation. It's very hard for them to get loans. Farmers traditionally have been able to get loans to pay for seeds, fertilizers, and seasonal help. And then when they sell their crops or they sell their livestock, they pay back the loans. Well, that has become very difficult for them. The amount they are receiving for their crops and their livestock, it has been going down, although the result of that was that very few livestock were even being grown. So this year they're actually getting a good price for the first time in a number of years, because there are fewer cows right now being raised in the United States than there have been since 1951. So 74 years, we have the lowest number of cows.
That's insane. Our population had to have
More than doubled.
doubled. Yeah.
More than doubled. The cows are a little bigger. They take a little less long to grow, but we have become a net beef importer in the United States. So the land of the cowboy. I mean, we were it for beef for so many years, and now we're importing beef. 26% of the ground beef in the grocery store is imported. It's almost all the ground beef has pink slime. You don't know the conditions under which those animals were raised. Animals from overseas may have been eating grains or hay that was contaminated with pesticides. You have no idea, because they don't have to follow the same rules that farmers and ranchers do in the United States. So that's one problem. There are not enough. So because of increasingly egregious regulation, most of the meat processing plants shut down in the United States in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And so now, depending where you are ranching, you may have to make an appointment with a meat processor to get your cows slaughtered 2 years in advance. 2 years in advance. And when you bring them there, you have to take the price that they give you, because there are so few processors. There's only 4 companies, and 2 of them are not owned by Americans, process 85% of the beef in the United States of America. 4 companies process 85%. So they are basically in cahoots. They are effectively a monopoly, and they want to control every aspect of meat processing. They would love, if they could, to put all the cows into CAFOs, into small buildings, feed them, and get rid of the ranchers entirely. But they can't, because cows need grass. They can't live on grain their whole lives. They've done this with pork. Pigs hardly go outside anymore. So 4 companies controls about 60-something% of all the pork in the United States, and so they have taken farmers who own land, and they've told them to build buildings and grow pigs for these large companies, and the farmer has become a serf on his own land. So he's told what to feed the pigs, how to grow them, what fertilizers to, everything, what chemicals to use, what antibiotics to use, and then when they're finished being grown, he gives them back to the large meat company, and then he gets again what they want to pay him. And so farmers are barely surviving. The same is true of chickens. There are just a few chicken companies that dominate the whole chicken industry in the United States. So even though you will see local farms growing chickens, they don't own the chicks, they don't own the feed, they don't own the antibiotics or the pesticides that are being used. Everything is brought by truck to them, and then a truck comes and either picks up the broilers when they're grown or picks up the eggs, and the farmer gets, a price, and then the huge multinational company charges what they want to the grocery store. When we went through this bird flu scare last year, these companies were able to raise their prices enormously. So in some places, you're paying $12 for a dozen eggs. The farmer wasn't getting any of that. The farmer was on contract with the big egg company and only got what the contract said. And then the farmers often went out of business because they weren't allowed to grow any more chickens for a period of time. They had to clean up their property. If one bird had a PCR test that was positive for bird flu, they were in trouble. So all of these things have come together. Of course, the price of fertilizers has gone up a lot. The price of all the inputs has gone up, and farmers are required by federal law to pay farm help $18 an hour. Well, if you're growing cattle in Mexico, you're paying your farm help $1 to $2 an hour. And then you're sending the meat here to be sold. So how can American ranchers compete with Mexican ranchers? These are the things that farmers are dealing with. We've got a list of 50 different ways farmers are basically being attacked, losing their land, and it seems that this may be part of a globalist plan to consolidate and gain control of food industries globally, as well as in the United States. There are some funky ways this is being done. For instance, telling farmers, using USDA funds, telling them, well, we will give you money if you allow us to tell you how to better manage your farmland more in a more environmentally sound way. So they bring in an NGO, let's say the Nature Conservancy, and the farmer gets money, and the Nature Conservancy now tells them what they can do with their land or part of their land. And it's not too bad now. They're just, this part has an endangered species, so don't farm this little area, but you can do what you want with the rest. But as time goes on, the papers that the farmer signed and didn't really understand can lead to the Nature Conservancy having more and more control over what the farmer can do, to the point where now you're not allowed to grow on your land or to raise cattle on your land. The land then becomes less valuable. The farmer has to sell off, and he's gone.
This is just crazy, isn't it? I have this idea that the reason that they're so against beef is because, it's one of the best foods for us. And, you talked about, the pigs, the chickens are the same way. They're done in these factories where, it's GMO soy feed with glyphosate on it. The beef, like you said, it's eating grass most of its life, so it's a lot more nutritious, and we're not seeing the glyphosate come through as much when in these factory products, or when it's done this way. We are seeing, of course, though, that the glyphosate is a chelator, so then it's not as nutritious. The beef isn't, as if it was grass fed, grass finished, but still a lot better than the alternatives. So it's funny because they say, hey, listen, we want to do this for carbon emissions and all of this sort of stuff, but they're never pushing forth the idea of like rotational grazing, building the soil, doing things without
Right,
chemicals, are they?
right, exactly. There's only about 10% of farmers who are doing these regenerative practices. And that's because it's hard and they're not encouraged to do so. And I was talking about the loans they need. Well, so another thing that farmers try to do is get crop insurance so that if their crop fails a certain year, they will be paid. They will collect money from an insurance company that is supported by the government. So the government came up with the idea of crop insurance. The government pays right now 62% of the cost of that insurance. The farmer pays 38%. But in order to be eligible for the crop insurance, you have to be using best practices, which means glyphosate, you know, and other, GMOs. So farmers feel like they're stuck in a rut and they can't get out of that rut, until the government changes the rules.
Right. It's a big handout for these big chemical companies in effect, because they're subsidizing this way, and it's just, but it's not in our best interests. We see that we're about the sickest country on the planet, using the most GMOs, using the most glyphosate, and yeah, it kills the soil. Again, kills the insects, kills the butterflies, kills the bees, but it's safe to spray on our food right before we eat it. That's
Right.
just unreal, isn't it?
Well, I mean, we can look around and see how many insects there were when you were a kid or I was a kid. You drove at night and your windshield was splattered with insects. Now you drive at night, you might get 3 insects on the windshield. Something happened, and luckily the bugs don't live that long. They can bounce back if we stop attacking them. We don't even know whether it's the neonicotinoid seed coatings, whether it's the geoengineering, whether it's electromagnetic rays that are, or glyphosate. We just don't know, and the government has not been terribly helpful at elucidating what is causing the birds and the bees and the other insects to drop precipitously in numbers. And they are the canaries in the coal mine. So this stuff is not good for us. We know it's not good for us. We don't have good information about how bad it is, which are the worst, because the EPA, which is charged with doing that science, doesn't do it. And unfortunately, under Trump, we have an EPA that is really no different than the EPA under Biden right now, and that's a big problem. Hopefully, it can be solved.
You mentioned the bird flu and how a lot of farmers were put out from that. Bill Gates funded research for a more transmissible bird flu, about 15 years ago. And, this is, you read a lot about biowarfare. Is there like people really concerned about, the use of this mRNA technology and the gain of function technology and the GMOs by these big international conglomerates, who they have a financial interest at stake when they create blights, famines, when they create plagues like this?
Um, so yes, people have talked and written about this issue. That, for instance, if you're a coffee manufacturer and you can somehow cause a blight to be spread on your competitors' coffee beans, right, the value of your coffee beans will go up. So um, this is a problem, and it's very difficult to identify whether an epidemic is deliberately caused or just happened, out of the blue, right? Some people are still arguing that COVID happened out of the blue and didn't come from a lab. I um, I was the first person in the world who actually studied an epidemic, which was the world's largest anthrax epidemic, which occurred in Rhodesia during its civil war. And I was able to show, using a lot of different methods, that uh, the anthrax epidemic in that country was due to biological warfare. It could not have happened naturally. So I proved that, and I proved that 33 years ago. But nobody wants to really get into that kind of study. It can be dangerous for the scientist, and it may be a military that's responsible. We don't. It may be a country. It may be an industry. Unless you have a whistle, you can prove perhaps that it's biological warfare, but unless you have a whistleblower, you don't know who was the actual perpetrator. You see, so even when you prove that it happened, you're still stuck with this can of worms of who did it and why. And can they be brought to justice? Well, nobody ever has been brought to justice for causing any kind of an epidemic, except some tiny little epidemic in the Dalles, Oregon, which was somebody working for a guru back about 30, 40 years ago, and they poisoned a salad bar, the salad dressings in a salad bar, to stop people voting so that they could win an election in a county in Oregon. So
Wow.
that happened. But other than that, you can't prove it. And so people have been, there's an incentive to use biological warfare against crops, animals, or people, because it's very unlikely that you will, come to justice.
That's scary stuff here. And then I guess, and then the other side of it is the biochemical warfare, which is really opened the door by this big ag liability shield if this goes through. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I should mention that Cuba claims the United States has used biological warfare on its crops and animals and humans at least half a dozen times. They've made this allegation at the UN, and certainly the fact that Cuba has had these weird epidemics of different things, like dengue twice that killed over 100 children, when there was no dengue anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere. Um, uh, some of those allegations certainly bear investigation.
That's so wild. Yeah. Oh, I think the answer to these big problems is, yeah, we got to keep speaking up and use free speech while we got it. And yeah, support the small farmers because that's where you have this local resilience, this independence, and safe food that we can eat. Is
Right.
that
Quality
right?
food. Quality food. We don't want food from factories. We want local food grown in soil.
That's right. That's right. Well, thanks so much for joining today. I sure appreciate it. Is there anything else that we can add?
I think that's good.
All right.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Likewise. See you, doctor. Thank you.
Bye bye.